Would you let a stranger into your life? She did, for one night. But the weary father and his little girl carried a secret that would test her trust, her pride, and her heart. Lean in and let's begin the stirring tale of love, loss, and second chances. The snow had been falling since dusk, a steady, whispering hush that blanketed the prairie in white. It softened the edges of the world, turned the brittle grass into pale ghosts, and deadened every sound but the crackle of Eleanor Wade's fire. She sat near the hearth, legs tucked beneath her skirt, needle and thread in hand, as she worked to patch the elbow of an old flannel shirt. Each stitch was small and careful, a ritual she performed as much to quiet her restless mind as to mend the fabric. Outside, the wind shifted, rattling the window pane like skeletal fingers. The lantern on the table flickered. She glanced up, sensing something beyond the walls, an unease that settled in her chest all winter. Maybe it was the debts piling higher than the snowdrifts, or maybe it was the weight of too many nights spent alone in this cabin, with only her thoughts for company. Then it came, a sound that didn't belong to the night. 3 knocks, slow, deliberate. Eleanor froze, her needle paused midair. She hadn't heard approaching hooves, no wagon wheels crunching over the crusted snow, just those knocks, low and insistent, as if whoever stood on the other side was testing her resolve. For a heartbeat, she thought of staying silent. Folks in Dry Creek whispered about desperate men roaming the plains when supplies ran low, men who wouldn't think twice about forcing their way in. She reached for the iron poker beside the fire, fingers tightening around its cool length. But then a voice came through the door. "Ma'am." Low, rough, tired. Eleanor's pulse quickened. "My little girl, she's cold. We just need shelter till morning. Nothing more." The poker trembled in her hand. A child? She shifted toward the window, pushing the curtain back just enough to glimpse outside. In the weak lantern glow from her porch, she saw them, a man and a small figure bundled in a too-thin shawl, perched on a sway-backed horse. The man's shoulders were broad, but slumped with exhaustion. Snow clung to his coat and hat, and even from here, Eleanor could see his hands gripping the child tight against him. The little one's head lolled on his shoulder. Eleanor's breath caught. This was no bandit, no thief come to take her meager belongings. She set down the poker and stepped toward the door. Her boots creaked on the floorboards. One by one, she slid back the heavy bolts, the sound loud in the silence. When she pulled the door open, the cold slammed into her, a sharp slap that stole her breath. He looked up. The man's face was shadowed beneath his hat, but the lantern light caught his eyes, gray as storm clouds, rimmed with fatigue. "Please," he said. His voice cracked on the word. "Just for the night." Eleanor hesitated, then stepped back. "Come in." He ducked his head in gratitude and carried the child inside. The cabin's warmth hit them like a wave, and the man staggered, steadying himself on the doorframe. The girl stirred, a faint whimper escaping her lips. "Here," Eleanor said softly, pointing to the cot near the fire. "Lay her down." The man obeyed, moving carefully as if afraid she might break. The girl's face, flushed with cold, peeked out from under the shawl. Wisps of pale hair clung damp to her forehead. "She's burning up," Eleanor murmured, touching the child's cheek with the back of her hand. "I know," he said, his voice low. "We've been riding too long." Eleanor fetched a damp cloth and pressed it gently to the girl's skin. "What's her name?" "Lila," he answered. "And yours?" "Sam. Sam Carter." Eleanor nodded but didn't offer her own. "Not yet." Sam sank onto the floor beside the cot, his hat in his hands. His coat, though fine, was travel-worn, the leather cracked and stained from the road. He looked like a man unaccustomed to asking for help, and it seemed to cost him something to sit there, silent and still. Eleanor busied herself with the kettle, setting it to boil over the fire. Her cabin was small, too small for strangers, but a weight in Sam's eyes kept her from sending him back into the storm. When she handed him a tin cup of tea, his hands trembled slightly as he took it. "Thank you," he said. "It's only willow bark." might help bring her fever down. He gave her a faint, almost shy nod, then turned his attention back to Lila. The girl whimpered again, and he smoothed her hair, murmuring words too low for Eleanor to catch. The fire popped. Outside, the wind howled against the eaves, but inside, the world had grown very still. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, watching them. Something about the way Sam touched his daughter, gentle, almost reverent, pulled at her chest. It had been years since anyone had filled this cabin with such quiet devotion. "You're welcome to stay the night," she said finally. "But come first light, we'll be gone," he finished. Their eyes met. For a long moment, neither spoke. When Eleanor finally turned away, she felt a curious ache in her ribs, as though her heart had stirred from a long slumber. The snow piled higher outside. As she banked the fire and the shadows deepened, Eleanor didn't yet know the man and child she had led would soon hold her entire future in their hands. But the night knew, and it kept its secrets well. The wind outside pressed hard against the cabin walls, a mournful sigh that seeped through every crack and made the lantern flame shiver. Eleanor sat in her chair, hands folded in her lap, her eyes flicking between the kettle and the two figures stretched out on the cot. The man, Sam, hadn't moved for hours except to adjust the damp cloth on his daughter's forehead. His hat sat on the floor beside him, his dark hair falling loose around a face drawn tight with exhaustion. Lila shifted beneath the quilt, murmuring in her fevered sleep. Eleanor rose quietly and knelt beside the girl, feeling her brow again. It was still too warm, but the flush in her cheeks had dulled. Eleanor glanced at Sam. "She's fighting it off," she whispered. "The tea and rest are helping." He exhaled, a sound closer to a prayer than a breath. "You've done more than I could have asked for." His voice was hoarse, yet there was a steadiness beneath it, like a man holding the weight of too many years alone. Eleanor busied herself with the kettle, pouring the steeped willow bark into a chipped mug and setting it before him. "Drink. You'll need your strength by morning." He hesitated, then took it with a nod. His fingers brushed the rim, as though the warmth surprised him. The fire crackled between them, filling the silence. Eleanor watched the shadows dance across his face. There was something in the set of his jaw, a quiet determination tempered with weariness. She found herself wondering where he'd come from, what had driven him into the storm with a child in his arms. "You live far from here?" she asked softly. His eyes stayed on the flames. "Far enough. Been riding near 3 weeks." "That's a long journey in winter." He nodded but offered no more. Eleanor wanted to press, but his guardedness was like a wall she didn't yet know how to scale. Instead, she studied Lila's small hand curled against her father's sleeve. The child had clung to him even in sleep, as though afraid the world might steal him away if she let go. "She's a brave little thing," Eleanor murmured. Sam's lips twitched at the corner, too fleeting to call a smile. "She's all I've got left." The words hung between them, heavy and unadorned. Eleanor felt the familiar sting of recognition in her chest. She turned her gaze to the fire. "Loss, it leaves a hollow you can't fill. You just learn to live around it." His eyes lifted to hers. "You know that, do you?" She nodded once. "My husband, 3 years ago." The cabin creaked under the weight of the wind. Neither spoke for a time. Finally, Sam shifted, his voice quieter. "I didn't mean to bring trouble to your door. I just—" He trailed off, his thumb tracing the edge of the mug. "I couldn't watch her freeze." Eleanor shook her head. "You didn't bring trouble. Just 2 souls in need of warmth." Lila stirred, coughing softly. Eleanor knelt again, adjusting the quilt around her small shoulders. "She's strong," she said gently. "Like her father, I suspect." Sam gave a low hum that might have been agreement or doubt. He brushed a lock of hair from his daughter's face. "Her mother's strength," he said finally. "I've only tried to carry her through." Eleanor looked at him then, not just at the travel-worn coat or the tired eyes, but at the way his fingers lingered on the child's hair, the reverence in his touch. It was rare to see a man carry so much gentleness. She wanted to ask more, where he was bound, why the journey, but the weight in his expression held her back. This was not a man ready to bare his soul to a stranger. The fire settled into glowing embers. Eleanor placed another log gently on the grate, coaxing a small flame back to life. "You can take the cot," she said quietly. "I'll manage in the chair." Sam shook his head. "I'm fine here. You'll be no good to her if you can't sit straight come morning." He met her gaze. For a moment, something passed between them, something unspoken yet deep enough to stir the air. Then he nodded and eased himself onto the cot beside Lila, keeping a protective arm around her. Eleanor wrapped herself in a blanket and settled into the chair. Sleep came in fits, broken by the hiss of the wind and the occasional sound of Sam murmuring to his daughter. Once she heard him say, "We'll find our place, Lila. No more running after this. I swear it." Eleanor's eyes opened at that, but she kept still. By the time dawn began to pale the edges of the curtains, the fire had burned low. Eleanor rose to stir the embers, her body stiff from the chair. She turned to find Sam awake, watching her. "Morning," she said softly. "Morning," he returned, his voice still hushed as though not to wake the child. "I'll make some bread before you ride out." "You've done enough," he said. "Bread's no trouble." Sam looked as though he wanted to say more, but he only nodded, his gray eyes unreadable in the dim light. As she mixed flour and water at the table, Eleanor felt a peculiar ache again, the one that had settled in her chest since she'd opened the door to this man and his daughter. By the time the smell of baking filled the small cabin, she knew she would miss them. When the horse was saddled and Lila bundled tightly against the cold, Eleanor stood on the porch, hands tucked into her apron. "You've been kinder than I deserved," Sam said gruffly, holding her gaze. Eleanor shook her head. "Safe travels, Mr. Carter." Lila reached out from beneath her shawl and handed Eleanor the small rag doll she had carried the night before. "For you," she said shyly. Eleanor's breath caught. She knelt and closed the child's fingers back around the doll. "You keep her, sweetheart. She'll watch over you." Lila smiled faintly and nestled back against her father. As they rode off into the pale morning light, Eleanor stood rooted to the porch, the chill biting through her sleeves. She watched them disappear over the hill, the sound of hooves muffled by snow. Long after they were gone, the cabin felt too quiet, too still, as if it too waited for something to return. And somewhere deep down, Eleanor couldn't shake the sense that this was not the last time she'd see Sam Carter. The wind curled around the cabin walls, carrying with it a faint whisper, almost like a promise. The letter arrived on a brittle morning, carried by a boy too young to know the way of the paper in his hands. Eleanor stood at the threshold of her cabin, apron dusted with flour, and accepted the envelope without a word. The boy tipped his cap and ran off, his boots crunching over frostbitten grass, leaving only silence in his wake. The envelope bore the mark of the railroad company. Her breath caught. It wasn't the first letter they'd sent her, but something in the thickness of the paper, the firmness of the seal, made her stomach tighten. She closed the door slowly, her hand lingering on the latch as if keeping the outside world out for just one more moment. The cabin felt colder than usual, the air heavy. She placed the envelope on the table and stared at it, willing it to dissolve, to vanish like a bad dream. But it stayed, stark and pale against the dark wood. Finally, with fingers that didn't feel like her own, she broke the seal. Her eyes scanned the words once, then again, though the meaning struck her instantly, sharp as a blade. The Holloway ranch, her ranch, had been sold. The ink seemed to shout, though the words were neat and formal. The company had transferred ownership to a private party. No more debt collectors, no more threats of foreclosure. The land was no longer hers, yet they had the audacity to thank her for her cooperation. At the bottom, the signature loomed like a ghost. Samuel Carter. Eleanor's chest constricted. She set the paper down carefully, almost reverently, though her fingers itched to tear it apart. Sam Carter, the man she let into her home, The man she'd given shelter and bread and firelight. The man whose daughter had smiled at her shyly, as if she were the first good thing they'd seen in weeks. A sound rose in her throat, low and raw. She pressed her hand over her mouth to keep it from escaping. For a long time she stood there, staring at the letter. Outside, the wind rattled the bare branches, and a crow called sharply across the frozen field. By mid-afternoon, she had saddled her horse. The ride into town was long, the cold biting at her face until it felt numb. Her thoughts churned with the rhythm of hoofbeats. What had he meant by coming to her door that night? A test of her character? A cruel game? She remembered the gray eyes that had watched her so carefully, the gentle way his hand had cupped his daughter's head, and felt her anger splinter, only to flare again. By the time she reached Dry Creek, the sun hung low, washing the streets in copper light. The town bustled with wagons and merchants, but her focus narrowed to the large brick building near the bank, the only place a man like Sam Carter could be. She dismounted stiffly and strode to the doors, the scent of polished wood and ink heavy in the air. Behind the counter, clerks paused, startled by the determined woman in a plain wool coat with fire in her eyes. "I need to speak with Mr. Carter," she said, her voice tight but steady. One clerk fumbled. "He's in the back, ma'am, signing papers." She didn't wait for permission. Her boots echoed across the floor as she pushed through the door at the rear. Sam was seated at a polished oak desk, pen in hand. Sunlight poured through the tall window behind him, gilding the edges of his figure in a golden glow that made her breath catch for reasons she didn't care to examine. At the sound of her entrance, he looked up. For a moment, surprise flickered across his face, real and unguarded. Then something quieter settled there, a stillness that only deepened the storm building in her chest. "Eleanor," he said softly, setting the pen down. She hated the way her name sounded on his lips, hated that it carried the same gentle cadence as it had that night by the fire. "You," she said, her voice low, "bought my land." Sam's jaw tightened. "I did." "Why?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood, hands clasped behind his back, his eyes steady on hers. "I bought it to keep it from them," he said finally. "The railroad. They wanted to strip it bare for track and timber. I made them sell to me instead." Eleanor let out a sharp laugh that didn't sound like her own. "So I'm supposed to thank you for stealing the ground out from under my feet." "I didn't steal it." His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it now. "I paid off the debt, took the deed, and if you'd give me a moment, I'd explain why." "I don't want your explanation," she shot back. "I want my land." "It's still your land," he said quietly. "If you want it to be." Her breath hitched. "What are you talking about?" "I didn't buy it to take it from you. I bought it because I can't watch them ruin another place, another life. I want you to keep running it. I'll provide the backing. You'll keep your home. Your name stays on the ranch." Eleanor stared at him, her heart pounding. "You expect me to work for you?" "I expect us to work together," he said evenly. "It doesn't have to be what you think." She shook her head, stepping back. "You should have told me. That night. Instead, you sat at my fire and let me believe you were just some weary drifter." "I needed to see it," he said, his voice softening. "The land, the woman who's kept it alive through winters and debt collectors. I needed to know if saving it was worth the fight. And," she asked bitterly, "and it was," he said simply. Silence fell. A sound tugged at her skirts. She looked down to see Lila peeking around the doorframe, clutching her doll to her chest. "Miss Wade," the girl said shyly. "You came." Eleanor's anger faltered at the sight of her. The child's eyes held no deception, only the quiet trust of someone too young to understand the weight of land deeds and betrayal. "Hello, Lila," Eleanor said softly. Lila smiled and stepped forward, holding out the doll. "You can have her now. Papa said we're staying here for good." Eleanor knelt, her hands trembling as she brushed a lock of hair from the girl's face. "You keep her, sweetheart. She belongs with you." Lila's smile widened. When Eleanor looked up, Sam was watching her, his expression unreadable. She rose to her feet, drawing a breath sharp as ice. "I need time," she said, her voice steady now. "This isn't a small thing you're asking." "You'll have it," Sam replied. She turned and walked out, her steps measured, though her heart raced. The evening light spilled across Main Street as she emerged, casting long shadows on the dirt road. Eleanor mounted her horse slowly, the letter still crumpled in her pocket, like a stone she couldn't set down. As she rode back toward the ranch, the wind tangled in her hair, whispering a question she couldn't yet answer. And though she tried to push the thought away, she couldn't help but wonder if Sam Carter's arrival was less an ending than the start of something she had never dared imagine. The snow had begun to soften with the coming of spring, though the nights still clung to their chill like an old habit. Eleanor stood on the porch of the Holloway Ranch, arms folded against the wind, watching the field where the earth was starting to wake. Patches of green peeked through the frostbitten ground, timid but determined. She'd spent the last weeks working harder than ever, mending fences, tending to stock, and pretending she didn't think about Samuel Carter every time the wind carried a faint scent of leather and pine. But tonight was different. Tonight, she could hear the steady creak of wagon wheels on the road leading to her gate. She saw them before they saw her. Sam, walking alongside a small wagon loaded with sacks of seed and tools, and Lila perched high on the bench, her braids swinging with every bump. The girl spotted Eleanor first and waved so hard the reins slipped from her lap. "Miss Wade." Lila's voice carried over the field like the first bird call of morning. Eleanor's lips curved before she could stop herself. She lifted a hand in return, though her chest ached with something she couldn't name. When they reached the porch, Sam tipped his hat, his gray eyes searching hers carefully. "Didn't want to come uninvited," he said. Eleanor nodded toward the wagon. "Looks like you came to work." "If you'll have me," he replied. They stood there for a beat too long, the air between them thick with everything unsaid. Then Lila jumped down from the wagon and ran up the steps, wrapping her arms tight around Eleanor's waist. "Papa said we're staying here to help." Her small voice was muffled in Eleanor's skirts. Eleanor knelt, smoothing a hand over the girl's hair. "Is that so?" "Yes, ma'am." Lila beamed. "And I'm going to help, too. I can sweep and feed the chickens, and—" "I'm sure you'll be a great help," Eleanor said softly, her throat tightening. Sam cleared his throat behind them. "We don't mean to crowd you, if this isn't—" "It's fine," Eleanor interrupted, rising to her feet. "There's plenty to do. Might as well get started." For the first time in weeks, she saw relief flicker across his face. He nodded and began unloading the wagon. Over the days that followed, the three of them settled into a fragile rhythm. Sam worked the fields with quiet intensity, his strong hands coaxing life from the stubborn earth. Eleanor caught herself watching him sometimes, watching the way he moved with purpose, the way he taught Lila to handle the smallest tasks with care. At first, she kept her distance, wary of how easily he had stepped into her world. But then came the moments she didn't expect. Like the evening Sam fixed a hinge on the barn door, his fingers brushing hers as he passed a hammer. Or the morning he left a basket of kindling by her stove without a word. Small things that felt heavier than they should have. Lila, however, needed no such caution. She followed Eleanor everywhere, chattering about her doll and the chickens, and the way the clouds looked like ships sailing across the prairie sky. The child's laughter filled the cabin, echoing in corners that had been silent for far too long. One night, after supper, Eleanor sat by the fire, darning a torn hem on her dress. Sam stood at the window, staring out at the moonlit fields. "Why me?" she asked suddenly. He turned, brows furrowing. "What do you mean? Why save this ranch? You could have let it go. You could have started fresh somewhere else." Sam's gaze softened. "I reckon we're both stubborn in our own ways." "That's not an answer." He stepped closer, the firelight painting gold across his face. because it felt right, because you fought too hard for this place to have it ripped away. Eleanor looked down at her hands. And if I hadn't agreed to let you stay, I'd have found a way to protect it anyway, he said simply. But I hoped you might let us in. His voice was low, careful. Eleanor's heart thudded in her ears. She wanted to speak, but no words came. That night, long after Sam had retired to the spare room and Lila had curled up beneath her quilt, Eleanor sat awake by the fire, staring at the flickering embers. She thought of her late husband, of the promise she'd made to keep this land alive, and she thought of Sam, of the way he carried his grief like a man carrying a wounded bird, tender but terrified it might die in his hands. Morning broke with soft rain, a steady drumming on the roof. Eleanor found Sam outside, already at work mending the east fence. "Coming out of the rain," she called. He looked up, water dripping from the brim of his hat, and for the first time she saw him smile, not a polite curl of the lips, but a real, unguarded smile that lit his tired face. She felt something inside her shift. That evening, as the rain slowed to a mist, Eleanor set an extra place at the table without thinking. When Sam and Lila came in, she handed him a steaming bowl of stew. "This is your home, too, for as long as you want it," she said softly. His eyes met hers, and the silence between them was louder than any words. Later, as Lila drifted off to sleep by the fire, Sam stood on the porch beside Eleanor. The air smelled of wet earth and new grass. "I never thanked you," he murmured. For that first night, Eleanor turned to him. "You did, in your way." The wind curled around them, gentle now, like a breath let out after holding too long. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in years, the thought didn't frighten her. And when Sam reached for her hand, she didn't pull away. Did this story settle in your heart like a campfire's glow? Subscribe, share your feedback, and perhaps share it with someone needing a little warmth.